Good morning, everybody. We are here today for another fantastic design panel. I'm just going to reveal the other lovely lady in the panel with me this morning, and then later on we got more experts that are going to join us. Here she is. Good morning, Emma.
Good morning, Sarah.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yeah.
Right, so as we were saying, we will be talking today about this incredible project that Emma and the team carried on in Manchester at the beginning of the pandemic. And in 14 days, they managed to build a full hospital. So today we'll hear from Emma Lepley. She is the architect associate at BDP. And she was the design team lead for the NHS Nightingale Hospital Northwest, an emergency hospital to support the COVID-19 response, built in Manchester Central, a Grade 2 listed building. She was on site from day 3 until handover, leading the design team in person and remotely, coordinating construction live on site with consultants and sub-consultants, developing the clinical design with stakeholders, the army, project managers, and procurement managers. Emma is passionate about designing places for people and the benefits that good architecture and design can bring to healthcare buildings, whilst enhancing the staff and patient experience. Later on today, we'll also be joined by Hines, the Chief Executive at Manchester Central. Sean leads the team at Manchester Central in his purpose to connect people, ideas, and business through meaningful experiences at live events and in the new virtual and hybrid space. Sean is passionate about Manchester Central's contribution to the city's economy. He ensures the venue sits at the heart of the local business community whilst maintaining its standing as a leading international convention centre. Also with us today is John Fowler, contract manager at Vinci Construction. With 35 years of experience working in the construction industry, 15 of which at Vinci Construction, John has a wealth of insight and expertise to share. Having delivered over £300 million worth of successful projects, healthcare projects across the Northwest during his career, there isn't much he doesn't know about the sector. And that is why he played a vital role in the Nightingale project. Speaking about the rapid turnaround for the NHS Nightingale Hospital Northwest, John proudly quips, "Rome wasn't built in a day, but we weren't on that job." Also with us is Neil Grimes, Associate Director at Arcus. Neil has extensive knowledge and experience of the NHS as a senior manager with over 25 years of experience setting up and running public-private partnerships, negotiation, EU procurement, and managing change in complex environments. Neil has experience as a company director on the board of several PPPs. He was embedded with the Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership as a state lead to developing and implementing their estate's strategy, establishing an estate's PMO, and developing and implementing programs, including locally asset reviews and master planning of acute sites across GM. Major Matt Fry is another speaker we have got the honor of having with us today. He is a civil engineer with the Royal Engineers. Major Matt Fry is a professional chartered civil engineer within the Corps of Royal Engineers, with operational experience all over the globe, ranging from search for explosive ordnance disposal to the delivery of technical infrastructure in extreme and austere conditions. He was well placed to support the NHS COVID-19 response in the delivery of the NHS Nightingale Northwest Hospital. Throughout his career, he was driven innovative technology and continues to be a catalyst for positive change and the promotion of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Based on his experience working with the NHS Nightingale Northwest team, he is now conducting a detailed research project to harness generative design techniques in support of rapid infrastructure development for operations. And last but not least is Paul Jackson, IHP P22 Framework Manager. Paul has worked in the construction industry for 30 years and has played a number of pivotal PS/CP roles within the Procure framework since 2004. His first 8 years in healthcare were dedicated to project management delivery on live acute hospitals before he took this knowledge and experience into the pre-construction stages to benefit trust in defining robust, compliant, affordable projects. Paul's experience is in on-site delivery and working with many trust and design teams during pre-construction gives him a unique perspective and the ability to quickly get to the heart of a project requirement and the ability to propose workable and affordable solutions. This knowledge and experience was vital in the delivery of the NHS Nightingale Northwest, and Paul played a key role in managing the design team. Paul prides himself on this proactive approach to problem solving and enjoyed the opportunity to work alongside colleagues from the Army during the 13 days on site at Manchester Central, as well as the wider stakeholder and design teams. So as you can see, is a very, very, very interesting panel today. So I won't waste any more time and we'll pass on to Emma and her presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll just share my screen. So, okay, so building the Nightingale Northwest. I think Sarah's given the introduction and all the characters or some of the key characters that played a part. And we've already heard about Rome. Rome wasn't built in a day, but we weren't on that job. But this is just a slide about the team that put the project together. So IHP, obviously the NHS, BDP, NG Bailey, a number of project managers, Mott McDonald's, Arcus, and the Army, amongst many, many others. And that's just a shot of sort of the IHP and BDP team on the handover day. So this is how the project worked. It was procured under a P22 framework with NHS England and Manchester NHS Foundation Trust being the joint clients. A separate trust was actually set up to run the process, which was the NHS Nightingale Hospital Northwest Trust. Arcus and Mott McDonald were providing project management support with IHP, which is Vinci and Sir Robert McAlpine, a joint venture being the contractor on the project. BDP provided architectural services and M&E services, including lighting and acoustics. There was also fire engineers. But a key component part of the project team, which you wouldn't normally have, was the Army, and obviously the invaluable support of Manchester Central and their own structural engineers to talk about their sort of building. So just sort of a high level, when we started the project, there's obviously the Nightingale in London had already been started on site, and the reason for choosing these types of sites, the GMEX, the O2, is that you've got existing frameworks and structures that can allow you to plug other things in. So you've already got drainage, you've already got security and power, you've already got specific areas that are meant for private access or staff access. There's a fire strategy. So there's a lot of things in the existing building that we can make use of when we're trying to sort of rapidly set up a hospital in a short amount of time. And that's just a shot of the Nightingale in London before handover. So BDP were involved in that project, which started slightly before the Northwest project, and put together this sort of flat pack IKEA instruction manual on how to construct them. So this is all about scoping, how are we setting it out, what are we using to fit it out, procuring things, using materials and sets and modular components that are already easily available and that could slot in and be modularized. And the same really for your M&E kit, oxygen. So it's looking at rapid manufacturer, easy availability, and how that can be plugged into sort of an existing framework. So just rolling back to look at the site, obviously Manchester Central has been a key part of Manchester since the Victorian times. It's originally the main station, and it's sort of taken on many lives really through its life, and currently is a convention centre, but has also, I think, been even a car park and various other things, a bus station in its time. And that's a shot of how it looks today as a convention centre. So on Sunday, the 29th of March, BDP and IHP received the call. I think Manchester Central had been involved a little bit before, but that was the call to come to site and sort of find out what the project was all about. And at that point in time, COVID guidance from the NHS had already been published. So in healthcare projects, we worked to the health building notes and health technical memorandums instead of as well as building regulations. And they'd already published an HBN on how to set out a coronavirus emergency hospital. So on day one on site, we started Revit modeling the potential bed bases on the COVID guidance setting out, which was for intubated patients. There are a number of options which have impacts on the actual bed bay size. So there were critical decisions that the NHS had to make in the first sort of 2 days. Were they going to have intubated patients, or was it going to be for step down care? So for people who were being discharged from hospital and needed a bit less level of care. And all these decisions had impacts on the modular system we were going to use, the services coordination, how big the bed spaces would be, corridor turning bed spaces, etc. So the capacity testing sort of continued through day one against that original guidance and setting out how many sort of bed spaces we could get in the centre. The army were a key part of this interface. So I wasn't on site on day one, but my boss was, and there were a number of people working from home at the time. So it sort of worked where they were attending sort of really intense meetings on site, taking pictures of drawings, sending them back. But this was just starting to look at how we actually get goods in, how we get goods out, which are sort of clean and dirty areas. And the army was sort of really driving that meeting process through. So that's just a bit more about the logistics development. This is all still day one. So looking at using existing outbuildings to be a clean store in and a dirty store out, looking at how are staff going to come in, how are staff going to change, where are we going to protect people that have got PPE, you know, where are the toilets, all that sort of thing. So on day two, a few tweaks were made to the plan, which lost a few bed numbers, but were part of the sort of logistics discussions that had come out the day before, which was having to get goods in and out of the area safely by people that didn't necessarily have to be wearing PPE around the edges. So we've introduced stores along this sort of clean corridor spline, and also introduced staff bases. So the wards in this module sort of run vertically, and the staff base in the centre sort of nurses both sides. At the same time as we're sort of drawing and Revit modeling and sketching and taking pictures, people are really busy procuring things, mocking things up on site, because it's really key for the NHS to be able to see what that means. So NG Bailey's IHP had already worked together to mock up this, showing where the light would be, showing how the bedhead services was, based on non-intubated patients, which meant they could have a smaller bed spacing and therefore be able to have more beds in the facility. Almost as soon as that mock-up's built, it's sort of a backwards and to and fro process. So what we'll sort of talk about today is it's quite different to the normal architectural design process. But that mock-up was done, the trust signed it off. We'd already got the Revit model, and some tweaks were made based on the available module sizes of the PVC holdfast material. That's then sent back to the office to be worked up into the Revit. At the same time, a 14,500 metres squared of flooring was being laid already. So that's how the process sort of worked. If there's anything that could be started, it was started, while the other information followed behind. In the meantime, hotels were opening to accept the amount of people that were coming to site. So by the end of day two, we've got this partition setting out based on the assigned off module, and there's sort of a full setting out drawing done for IHP, who've got a 24-hour staff on site. So there's always a presence, there's always people building 24 hours. So on day three, there was more working up of the fire strategy plan, because although obviously this is a process which works really quickly, it's still got to be all designed through and thought through in terms of all the legislative requirements and safety, etc. So that was just working up how that would work. At the same time, we're sort of diving into the detail. So obviously, with only sort of 10 days, 11 days to go, IHP have got a massive task to be able to procure all the equipment they need, as do the trust. So there's the equipment procured by the trust and fixtures and fittings procured by IHP. So we started modelling these up, which we find it helps people to visualise a space that they can't see by using Revit and showing the 3Ds. And that also generates a list of equipment. So we're running user group meetings with people sort of on site to talk through the equipment they needed in these spaces. Meanwhile, the partition setting out drawing that we've issued the night before is well underway, and the holdfast sort of temporary partitions are being set out on site. And this is sort of where I tried to stop doing it day by day, because I realised the amount of things that happened in day four. This was the point where you kind of couldn't go through a day by day thing for a 20-minute presentation anymore. It'd take much longer. So in day four, there was 4 revisions of the plan in one day. We had a number of FF&E meetings, other key areas that got signed off for construction. We added in wash bays. So I think the pharmacist arrived on site and asked where the pharmacy was. We added in wash bays. So we've got clinical hand wash basins. Prior to that, there'd been a decision about whether they were going to use alcohol gel or running water to wash their hands. So all these things that have been added are coming back off key decisions which are being made by other people. So yeah, that's just a sort of a small list of some of the things that changed on day 4. But basically, the gist is absolutely rapid turnover of changing field of ideas and changing brief. Meanwhile, as well as the sort of nuts and bolts things, we've also got to be mindful of the graphics and the wayfinding. So to even get sort of signage and wayfinding procured in that length of time, we had to start that process while the plan wasn't actually necessarily that fixed. And this is the sort of a graphic drawing that one of my colleagues did. The orange areas are staff areas, the red areas are changing areas. So the don and doff area worked by a higher acuity area at the front, and staff would service that through these areas here. And then there was a lower acuity area at the back, so they were kept separate. The green's a clean corridor. The light blue is patient toilet and shower facilities with goods in, goods out that we mentioned before. So that's sort of broadly how the plan worked, working with the existing sort of framework of the GMEX in the building that exists to try and make as much use as we can of the existing. And that's just a bit more on that. So we're working on people flows. Where do people come in? Where do they go? How do they move through the building? And how do the logistics work? You know, we've got a really tight constrained city centre site. We've got to get ambulances to it. We've got to get fire engines to it, but also we've got to deliver. We've got to take waste away. We've got to deliver goods. But we're also putting new outbuildings and temporary structures on the only sort of open space in the car park. So BDP team did some vehicle tracking just to check that everything was going to sort of work as it needed to. So how did the process work? I thought it'd be good to sort of zoom out and look at how the process actually worked. Most people probably be familiar with the RIBA stages, and this is just to sort of demonstrate that actually we were running all of the RIBA stages simultaneously. So while we were taking and making strategic briefing decisions with the client, we're also doing detailed design. So we're choosing ironmongery and things while we still weren't exactly sure how strategy would work. M&E coordinations happened simultaneously. Site queries, whilst also adding sort of rooms into the concept design. So the 1 to 200 level plan was changing at the same time as we're resolving furniture, fitting procurement issues. And we're also liaising with planning, building control and listed building consent, with it being grade 2 listed building, grade 2 star listed building. IHP have got the same issue. They're doing all the sections that they might normally do sequentially. They're doing them all at the same time as well. So we're both sort of dealing with that challenge. And a big part of that and how it worked is that we all had to work to what was available. So supply chain was just absolutely key in delivering the project in 2 weeks. It was about what there was, how much of it there was, and that changed the design. So effectively we worked with modularized sort of toilet Wernick cabins, and we had to use whichever ones were available. So the drawing would change based on the size that was available, and we used holdfast for almost everything. There's anyone that worked on the project will tell you there's not much you can't use holdfast for, but work to the modular sizes of those and the key component door sizes and vision panel sizes, etc. So how did it work? So anyone that's been involved in sort of public architecture projects will know that there's normally a rigid process that takes a long time, the sort of 3, 4, 5 years for hospitals particularly. And we had to condense that down into 2 weeks, but without losing the sort of process that we have to go through to make sure the client's happy with everything and everything works. So the way that worked was there was 2 meetings a day, which were driven by the Army. And none of the design team or IHP were enabled to attend those meetings, and that was purposeful in that the Army wanted to keep it as short as possible. So it was a real lesson in communicating. So anything you wanted to be asked or answered, anything you wanted to be signed off, anything you wanted to bring up or discuss had to be submitted in advance to IHP, who then submitted that to the project managers to raise with the client and the Army to drive that process through. And that happened twice a day. So effectively we had 2 deadlines a day. Anything asked in the 11 a.m. session had to be answered and confirmed by the 3 p.m. one, and vice versa. So there's a rolling sort of set of answers and queries being rigidly managed on a daily basis. As you'll know, construction programs are normally in days, weeks, months, years even. The construction program was in minutes, and genuinely, John Fowler said to me at times, you know, stop talking, you're 16 minutes behind program. And that was actually how it worked. Overnight, when there was less people in and just the contractors sort of building, they tended to get ahead of program, and while there were more meetings and people on site during the day, they tended to drop a little bit behind program. But in the end, the project was handed over early. And this is kind of the real life program in life, you know, a whiteboard and a pen. So what does this really look like, though? There's a process I've described. Well, it looks like using anything you can use to communicate as quickly as you can, but also producing detailed drawings, sketches. So it's informal meetings, 3Ds, hand sketches, quick sketches, mock-ups with whatever materials are available. We had daily briefings in the conference centre there, which were all socially distanced, where you'd set the scene for the day, what was going to happen on the day. We also had a lot of colleagues from BDP and others working from home. So we'd be texting, sending WhatsApps through, FaceTiming them, just improvising to do whatever we could do to get the job done. So my colleague Dave using a laptop as a tracing pad. But it also looks like this. So like I said, FaceTiming, we ate 3 meals a day together on site. So there's a canteen that provided all the food and drink you needed. Homemade affogatos. There was a special coffee machine which was used heavily by all, and one of my favourite times when Vinci brought ice creams in. And there was also the ever expanding Vinci sweets in, which started out the size of a shoebox and ended up like a biffa bin. And power naps on site. That's my boss Jed just having a bit of a brief rest on a Teams call. So the final GA Rev P15, you'll see basically this drawing was used to describe absolutely everything. So there was printed out big scale at the front of the hall. There were lots of copies of it. And IHP will tell you people had full-time jobs going around making sure people didn't have the wrong A3 that they were working to. So sort of plan police, QA control going around and making sure, given that the plans would often change revision more than once in a day, but this gave all the information or referred to the detailed drawings they needed, as most people were just using this one drawing. So I thought it'd be good to show you a few of the key areas and how they sort of developed up, and sort of how they finally looked. So in terms of the reception area, there's some quick sketches that we did, talking about social distancing, how are we going to get wristbands to people, how are we going to check people in a safe way. That sketch was then modelled up in Revit using the component parts and the modular sizes of the holdfast, and that's sort of the finished product. So it was really a really fast turnaround process. And again, as mentioned, everything being made from holdfast, this box was going to originally be made by something else, but if we've got it available on site and we can make it from this, let's do that. We had David Anderson, who's a really talented infection control nurse, who would come around and look at everything. So he would make sure he was satisfied with every design decision, especially if anything was changing from something that had been agreed. Staff changing in showers. I think the Nightingale Northwest is the only facility that opened up the country that had somewhere for staff to shower and change. And this was completely built by scratch. It wasn't a facility that Manchester Central already had. So it was placed in the large open plan area, and we tapped into manholes through using elevated raised access floor to allow the drainage to go underneath. And there was also brand new ventilation for each cubicle that was then attached to opening windows to give the correct ventilation required. But I think, although Vinci on the live show of this, Vinci said it was actually one of the hardest challenges that they had to encounter for the whole build. But I think the feedback from the NHS was being able to have a shower after sort of a 12-hour shift in wearing PPE with COVID patients was just absolutely invaluable to them. And that just shows sort of an original sketch, details there, detailed sketch to the actual finished product. Don and doff areas, I touched on that briefly. So how people sort of put on and take off their PPE was really strictly controlled, so that had to be socially distanced as well. At the time we were on site, PPE wasn't widely available. So you'll notice from the pictures of us on site, none of us had PPE. Manchester Central had instigated a social distancing system already, actually, before it was sort of widely something that was done. But we had alcohol gel everywhere, we kept spaced out, but the same had to be done for the don and doff areas. So this is just how people go through and put on each individual piece of PPE with a 2 metre square spacing them apart, and then entering the other side. So that's just what that looked like in reality. So the ablutions block, I briefly showed you on the plan that we had patient staff and showers. at the edge of the building. Obviously, everything has to be considered in the context of Manchester Central being a listed building. So any additions have to be really carefully considered and have to be designed in such a way that they can be removed and restored back. So the idea of using these blocks and then attaching a scaffolded structure roof, which is then waterproofed in a sensitive way, which can be basically stuck to the outside of the building and then removed without damaging any of the bricks. This area was all screeded over and had vinyl floor. And one of the guys commented in the live presentation when it was done, you couldn't tell if you're inside or outside, only the fact that halfway down there was a sort of shiny painted bollard halfway through it, which you realise you're outside. And that's just showing that join that I was just talking about there and the waterproofing that went over these units. So yeah, utility space is a really key part to hospital design, and it's something that the Trust really wanted to maximise on bed spaces, but obviously they need to have enough utility sort of spaces to make the function still work for them. And in the end, we suggested making use of this service spine to have like a clean and a dirty side where you've got your wash hand basin, you can get rid of linen, you've got places to draw up drugs, whilst also maintaining the zone that you need for fire access, fire escape. And we turned one of the bed bays over on each ward, on each half of each ward, to that sort of function. So it effectively became like a store and a clean utility where people could wash their hands, get rid of things to service the rest of the ward. And this is just showing that sort of central spine with all the, the plumbed in units. This is also where you isolate the gas. There's a light on there, so it's kind of like the business end of things. And that's just an image of staff actually using that area in Ward 7. Signage has gone in. So the pharmacy, that was a really sort of a bit of a late addition. Again, it was built as a freestanding element in the open plan space, which was accessed through existing doors. But we had a really good company come in and build all the sort of ready-made equipment there and the fixtures and fittings to just provide a fully decked out pharmacy. Also, issues around security and safety were all discussed and resolved in terms of securing the drugs. And signage, so we've got signage from business end signage. So this is at the end clean corridor. We had fire marshals patrolling up and down there, looking down the vision panels to check all the time. So the process of part of the fire strategy was catch something early before it becomes a problem. But this still needed to be closed because it was effectively the barrier between the clean and dirty area. So this was sort of emergency signage for people to not break through these doors, which was also controlled with ironmongery. But we've also got the sort of nicer end of things. So the Manchester Central's existing signs are reprogrammed. We've got like a sort of nice big graphics for the main entrance. So we're considering all these things simultaneously with the rest of the brief. And that's just an image showing it nearly ready to be handed over. Sort of the oxygen pipes running through. You can see how much wiring goes into it there with power and data on every single bed bay. You can also see from this shot how we used colour. So we tried to use make the location of bays intuitive. So staff bases are in green, patient ones are in orange, and the wash utility bays are in blue, just so that you can look down and see where you're going quite quickly. The whole structure here is all sort of uni-strut. So I think Manchester Central had just finished the remedial works. I think there was over, I'm going to get it wrong, but over 10,000 holes or something like that in the floor from all the fixtures and fittings that had to be fitted in. So statutory approvals, how did we deal with that? We still had to do all of that. Obviously, we had to add oxygen tanks for it being a hospital. So we produced drawings, which we shared with the planners who were involved right from the start to talk about what that would look like in proximity to, the Hilton Tower and the Manchester Central. There was a temporary change in law. So under permitted development, emergency hospitals were allowed to basically facilitate the process of all these being built around the country under permitted development rights, which means we didn't need to do a change of use application. But despite this, we sort of kept close contact with the planning department in Manchester City Council to make sure they were happy with everything we were doing. That's just an image there of the oxygen tanks abutting against the Hilton. And this all needs to be considered in the context of the Manchester Central being a grade 2 star listed building. So how are we going to get oxygen in? And also the logistics challenge that we've already mentioned. So the oxygen tanks, there was a slab poured especially for them, which was put in the most appropriate place, but that meant that the oxygen had to be up and overed to allow vehicle traffic around for the fire engines and delivery vehicles. And you'll just be able to see here, we brought it into the building in a newer panel. I think I've got another image of that. So these sort of metal panels are probably from the 80s or 90s. Obviously not a part of the original building fabric, which is why we've done that, so that they can be replaced and it's not damaging the existing building fabric. And that's just another image of that. The other thing that had to be considered was privacy. So partway through the process, a few of us took a trip to a hotel over the road. There's a number of methods we tried. Obviously, it's people's privacy, and the NHS's privacy is really important, and we didn't want a situation where reporters or photographers could see in. So there's a number of methods we tested out, but ended up going for this temporary obscuring film that went on the windows, which they can then be removed. So it's been tested out and used on other listed buildings, and it can be removed and restored back to original state. With building control as well, we worked really closely with them, so they were on site as well, attending meetings and frequently on the phone, and we agreed a process with them of issuing commentary documents for parts B, M, L, J and H, and inviting them to meetings to talk through how that process would work. So they attended smoke modelling meetings with the fire engineer and ourselves and all the design team, and we submitted these sort of commentary documents to talk about how things have been mitigated, or which parts you know, how we'd worked around the design. And we've got a certificate of occupation. And that's just an image. I just like that. You know, it just shows you absolutely the volume and the quantity of work that has to be done to get everything moving, really. So as I said before, it's also about testing things out live. So we're mocking things up with coffee cups or you know, pieces of paper, whatever we could use, masking tape. In terms of the ambulance turning didn't appear to be big enough, and the answer was simply just bring one in. Let's see, can we get it around? Let's just drive it around and see if we can, and we could. So that's sort of that hands-on sort of way of designing and mocking things up and just trialing things out. So this is an image just before handover day of some of the IHP project management BDP team, just getting the final bay ready for the trust inspection. And I think the only comment that was made was we needed to add a chock for the wheels to stop the wheels going back into the to the bays. But other than that, everything was signed off. So on the opening day, as I said, it opened on time or a bit before time. There's a sort of a ceremony, a social distance ceremony and a speech from Clarence House, and that was sort of televised. That's some of the team. And that's the final image. Just some images of the finished version. And then the staff in there. You can sort of see those doors which the fire wardens patrol down there, I think, in the background. And that's the staff sort of getting their inductions and being taught around how everything works. And these are just some stats. So 750 beds were delivered. That's 750 bed-like bays, etc. I've already mentioned it was 24/7 working on site with over 1,000 people on site every day. And that's just some of the stats and figures about the amount of wash basins, cabling, how much hoard fast, how much flooring, etc. And I just really like this contrast, this image. I think the clock sort of ties it all together. So often when we were there and working on site, you just look up and just think of the enormity and the strangeness of what you were doing in basically putting an emergency hospital into a train station. And that's why I really like that key image of some staff there on Ward 7. And that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. So let's kick off with the panel discussion now and get the other gentlemen involved. There's a question for everybody, I suppose. From an emotional point of view, this was a job that was different from any other job. I assume you guys have ever worked. What is the biggest memory? Would you do it again? That's the big question.
Absolutely, we would do it again. Yeah.
And why?
It was so rewarding at a time when the whole of the UK were in panic. We didn't know whether we were putting our lives at risk. That's not being over dramatic. That's how people took it. But as soon as you walked in on day one, you were able to be part of something that was going to help. It was really uplifting. But then straight away, the army brought us back to reality of there's a task to do here. But for me, one of the most satisfying things was being able to translate that. At the time we were doing this, we were also doing our Hines. We're doing the Jersey Hospital. So we were able to relay all of our lessons learned on a daily basis. And I think most of this team then went on from Manchester to do a similar facility in Preston. So to be able to give that much back to the NHS was fantastic.
But one thing I remember was, I mean, I'd worked in the NHS for a long time. And the NHS usually takes an awful long time to make decisions. And it was phenomenal that once everybody knew the task they had to do, and we had help from the army and others, that we were able to make decisions very quickly. And it just shows you can do it. So that was super.
Go along the row. I'll speak next, shall I? So in our business as normal, if we can remember those days, we're used to building things in really short periods of time. You know, we build exhibitions in 2 or 3 days. They live for 2 days and then they get broken down. So actually the events industry and the venues around it were quite well versed in creating environments and then, you know, from scratch into something that would be used and occupied for that period of time. Obviously, we'd never built a hospital before, and I think, you know, if you want to start with building a brand new hospital, you probably don't choose a building from 1880, which is loads of iron, steel, and all sorts of little quirks and sort of unique features. But the history of Manchester Central, for those of you that know the building and know the city, it's quite a rich history. It's had periods of fallow time when it's been derelict. It's in more recent years, it's obviously been working as a conference centre. Prior to that, a large concert hall venue as well. So it's got, over the years, it's served many different purposes for the city, and it is a fixture. And I think one of the great things that we sell when we talk about Central and the city, it is really a part of the fabric and the landscape of what is Manchester, and everybody that lives or knows or works in Manchester knows the building, knows the arch, knows the clock. And so for something so imposing and such a part of the fabric of the city to be able to be deployed into something that was so critical and so rewarding, as you were saying, you know, for us it was a really simple decision to want to be a part of it and want to help. And yeah, those sort of, for us, it was about 3.5 weeks from the initial phone call to delivery. It was an extraordinary time, and you know, all of my team that were involved in it were very proud. But I'm also pleased to say that many of my team involved in the events industry were able to support the operation of the hospital as it continued as a Nightingale, whether that be in a security role, an engineering role, a facilities role, and equally pleasing, people that worked in events coming back as volunteers to the hospital, whether it was in hospitality or the housekeeping side of things, or just generally helping the clinical effort, whether it be portering or something like that. So it was an incredible experience, one that we'll look back on fondly. And you know, hopefully we won't have to do anything like it again, but we'll certainly be very proud of this moment in time, I think, for us as we are now, but in the future, as Manchester Central kind of archives its role in the city, this is a really important period for us.
For me, I think it was seeing absolute trust and camaraderie and that sense of ownership of a problem across sectors. So the construction industry can be quite combative. It's about making money at the end of the day. And we create contracts and we hit each other with contracts, and it's quite feudal often. All of that was put to one side and everyone collaborated, everyone worked together, and everyone trusted that people were making the right decisions for the right reasons. And that happened instinctively. So I was actually quite humbled by the way in which the UK construction industry came together for this one common effort. That's what I take away from it.
Well, where do I start? But from a personal sort of point of view, it was, as Matt said, it was collaboration in its truest form. I think if you look it up in the dictionary now, it says Nightingale, because that's exactly what it was about. It was a true collaboration of all parties. There was no red tape we had to cut through. It was all sort of, it was a common understanding of everybody. Anyway. Well, we used the word retrospective quite a lot throughout the process for good reasons. And I think that got us to where we needed to be. It was just a dynamic daily activity, right from start to finish, 24 hours a day. And to see everybody sort of take ownership of what they were actually dealing with was so refreshing and so different to anything else we've sort of come across throughout our daily work, you know. And it was humbling to see it all coming together, and it was all about availability for me. That was availability of resources. We were in the middle of a lockdown, in essence, so availability was tight, resource was tight, but you wouldn't have noticed that if you came onto that site at any given day. It was just teaming with people, and they were all doing the right thing at the right time with a bit of direction. But and when I found out that Sir John Fowler designed the original building, that seemed to be a little bit of karma for me. But yeah, that's what I thought.
I wouldn't have been anywhere else. I think that's the simplest way of putting it. I wouldn't have been anywhere else. I was somewhere else on day 1 and 2, which is why I made sure that I was there by day 3. And these guys have all been an absolutely fantastic, inspirational set of people to work with. And this is just a slice, isn't it? That goes way beyond. There's loads of people who aren't represented today. And you know, the guys have said it. The pulling together of people and the putting to one side of any other agenda than working together to get it done. And you know, on days where the plan was revised 4 times and people had to deconstruct what they'd already built from the tightest program ever, nobody ever complained. That's what really struck me. No one ever said, "Can't believe you've done that. Why has this happened?" Because everyone understood that, like you say, the decision was being made for the best reasons. But also to work, you know, within our team at BDP, there were 2 or 3 of us on site, but there were a lot more people at home logging on whatever hours to make sure the job got done. And that was just, you know, the whole thing's just been a really sort of humbling and good experience, I think.
So as you said, fingers crossed, we don't need to build another hospital at Masenza Central. So this experience and know-how you gained, how do you think is going to be used again in what kind of other projects you could implement some of the new procedures and elements you learned in this experience?
I think from a design management point of view, what was really useful, that were critical, was that we were able to implement that change control, and we had a number of different work streams working at the same time. So as Emma said, at 11 o'clock we had questions to the clinicians, at 3 o'clock we got the answers, at 3 o'clock they got another set of questions, they went on to the clinicians for the next day. That's unheard of in the industry, and I think it's because we had access to decision makers who were of the highest level. Big regards to David Anderson, who, as we said, in charge of IPC and quality, and the Ebola virus as hospitals in Sierra Leone. But there was a number of other clinicians, and when we were speaking to those clinicians through MOTSL or through the Army, there was absolutely no reneging on that decision. That decision was final. It was made by the right person. It was made quickly. It was made once. If we could try and do that, that would be a lesson learned, I think, that we could bring into the industry, which would be great from a time point of view and probably from a cost point of view.
Emma, do you think that's possible?
There's probably a happy medium somewhere, isn't there? You know, I think, and actually the pressure for some of those people that had to make those decisions. I remember meeting some staff who trundled in with their suitcases, not knowing what to expect. And, you know, there was somebody in flood of tears on day 2 because it was like, you've got to make the decision in an hour, and they're going, this is crazy, it's like affecting people's lives, it's legislation, it's this and that, and it's a massive amount of pressure to be put under. But I think, yeah, something to keep that decision-making process rolling a bit more speedily is definitely useful.
I think if I can add to that, we had to do that decision-making process in a completely different way, which Major Matt and the Army brought to us. We would normally, as Emma said, have a bit of dialogue and try and tease out the answers from a clinical team. Matt said, no, I need your question, and your question needs to be broken down into sub-questions, and each one of those sub-questions has a binary answer and an implication. So if it was, what kind of ventilation do you need? That had implications on whether we were intubated, whether we were CPAP patients, the facility, what could it achieve? So we had to break down each one of those questions into these sub-questions, and that's something that I'd never seen before.
No, that's true, actually. So to add to that, the way we're used to working, as Paul sort of said, is I'd be used to being able to ask people those questions, and then if they answer and I think of something else to ask, I can live ask that. And maybe what I didn't mention previously was none of IHP or the design team had that access to that process, and the thought behind that from the army, I think, was that would take too long, because if we were all there asking little extra bits and stuff, we just wouldn't be able to keep on programme. So actually having to in advance of think of all the possible combinations and permutations to put to them, that was quite a challenge really.
I think it was the big lever decisions which obviously Matt and his colleagues brought to the process, which really cut across all the minutiae really, and it was what is going to actually drive this project. What are the big levers, and that was, we're still using that today, you know.
Yeah.
But it was that type of, you need a decision, we need it now, otherwise it's not going in, and that was how quick and how instant it needed to be, you know, for 13 days work.
So that leads me to my next question, Major Matt. Well, how this experience compares to your usual job when you're building a hospital in Afghanistan, or to making sure there's no mines on the ground?
Okay, so routinely, if I was delivering infrastructure on operations, it's in conditions where we don't know all the facts. The situation is constantly changing. Customers don't know what it is that they actually need. People don't have time to make the decisions that they would like to make. All decisions that have been made so far could be turned absolutely on their head at a moment's notice, and we have to change to plan B. And so the way that we operate, the way that we train is in chaos. And as John said, the phrase that I always use is to look through the chaos. You mentioned that somebody was breaking down because it was just so overwhelming with the information overload, the decisions, the implications. The important thing is to be able to reach through all of that and think, right, well, what is it that is going to enable us to make this hospital? What's the one thing that is going to pull the rug out from underneath us? And when people are out of their comfort zones, often what they default to is what they know. So if I'm a clinician, I might start talking about my trade in very great detail because that's what I know. And they'd have to be cut off at that point. You've got time to do that later. The decision I need right here, right now, feeds into this bigger decision, and that's what we need. And so on operations, I'm surrounded by people who are used to operating that way, with conflicting information, changing information, and having to change decisions at a moment's notice. And then when we come back into the UK situation with COVID hitting, I treat it as operations. But the people that I'm working with aren't accustomed to that. You don't build a hospital ordinarily in 12 days. You take a number of months to talk about what your requirements are. And then you'll evolve those requirements into shapes, into equipment requirements. And that's the way that people are used to operating. And quite often, a lot of the clinician staff would come back and say, oh, well, on Wednesday, we're going to get more data and that will help us make more decisions. We haven't got till Wednesday to make that decision. You're the person on point. We need a decision now. And the best way of looking at that is to think about that decision that you're about to make and look at the implications. If I'm wrong, what does that mean? And often people would be discussing and talking about minutiae, where if they've got that decision wrong, it really doesn't matter or change anything. Stop talking about that. Something is good enough, make that work. If there are big implications, we explore that and work out what that means. Does it impact on the mission? Are we going to delay the hospital? Will it have a risk to life? And then how do we minimize that risk? So every decision that we make is a balance of risk. And that then ties into the legislation that we had to adhere to, the regulations that we have to adhere to. So it's a method of thinking, it's a way of working. And actually one of the big things that I remember taking away from this was that to begin with, I met the NHS team that were responsible for delivering this project. And I just remembered thinking how lost they appeared. I asked the question, has anyone ever built a hospital before? None of them had been involved in one before, but they've had to step up to the plate and step out of their comfort zone to deliver this. And by the end of the 2-week period, they absolutely owned that problem and they were confidently delivering that problem. And that was the best thing for me to see. So to begin with, it was me at the front sort of guiding people and having a presence, but I made it clear that before long I would be stepping back and the individuals responsible for the different sectors would be taking point on that. So
how did the team got together? Who selected the various stakeholders? Obviously, Manchester Central, you were, as an exhibition centre, the perfect venue, but then in the army, there's the...
I actually not, no. I mean, there was a, and Matt was in the middle of this, but there were a few choices, there were a few options that could have been selected. I think at one point there were 3 contenders, we being in the middle of Manchester and then a couple of others in sort of the outlying areas. And part of what Matt's initial reconnaissance was about was making sure that all of the pros and cons, balancing the risk, as you were saying, of the different venues was presented. Albeit, interestingly, there was definitely a move towards Manchester Central earlier than, if you like, that final speech to be Matt, but before that final decision had been ratified, there was some people in the room that said, no, it's Central, we're away, we're going. And that was partly because the trust involved in delivering it was based in the city centre, and therefore having a physical site in the city centre, if you like, in their domain, that actually made it more easy for them to kind of understand what was going on, rather than taking a space which may have been actually residing in a different borough. So, you know, rather than city centre control, it could have been in, I don't know, traffic control, or it could have been in somewhere else. So I think that was, yeah, we were certainly one of a few options to start with, but it was reasonably clear early on that actually the facility could work. And I think once we got past could work, then I think the work, you know, the team really started getting to grips with, right, how do we make it happen now?
That was really interesting for us as contractors, get into a grade 2-star listed building and find that it had been so well maintained in terms of its water regimes, its flushing regimes, all of the regular weekly, monthly checks that were in place. Often you go into a building and the maintenance isn't always 100%. This facility was absolutely spot on. But in terms of getting the rest of the team together, I'll speak to Neil in a second about his involvement. But I think BDP came from London. You've done the Excel, you brought all the lessons learned. And then from IHP, which is the joint venture between Stromberg Alpines and Vinci, we probably do most of the Northwest hospital work. There are 6 major contractors on the government framework. And it was the P22 framework and the NHS who came to us and said, we want IHP to deliver this Manchester facility. So in terms of MOT's involvement, Neil?
Yeah, well, we've been involved down in the one in London, working alongside MOT's. So we ended up being involved in quite a few around the country. And one of my colleagues from our Birmingham office, Chris, he ended up working for NHSC and I, signing off as they were completed as well. So we had to roll across the whole lot, including the one in Wales. But we were working in partnership with MOTS on quite a lot.
So John, I've got a cheeky question for you. Jed is asking, what was the total budget for your chocolate during the build?
I think it exceeded the cost of the project. It was quite substantial. Donations always welcome.
Shall we start a fundraising after this one? Guys, have you got any questions? No.
I'm really doing actually watching the whole process. It's fine for me, isn't it? But you have to do that happen. And the sense of the goodwill amongst you all. But the question I was going to ask was if that Manchester Central wasn't, if this happened again, and Manchester Central wasn't available, you know, what are the other who are the other contenders? What would you, have you learned from that? Presumably you choose the same building.
So, shall I go for that one? So my initial role, quite simply, was to go and reconnoitre the various options. The first one we looked at was the arena. Second one was Manchester Central. The third was Event City. And then as we tracked the cases, it was apparent that there was a spike emerging in Liverpool, and we were on the verge of going to Liverpool as well to look at other spaces.
Yeah, feature at some point as well, wasn't that the Manchester Stadium?
I thought that was discussed.
Yeah. And this is where the politics kind of comes into it. So could we have used the arena? given the history, thinking back to the Ariana Grande concert and the bombing, the layout of it, it wasn't really well suited for a hospital, but it would have been really well suited for a central mortuary. And this is where it starts getting, you know, there's some very difficult conversations to be had there, because we had planners within government trying to figure out how do we deal with potentially hundreds or thousands of deaths, and how do we cope with that? And when we raised the fact that the arena would be an ideal location for that, it gets turned off immediately, because presentationally that wouldn't fit with you know, what Manchester wants or needs. So look for another option. So the infrastructure is perfect, but the politics is not, and that's the right decision. When we look at Event City, we could have fit many more bed spaces in there and had a much better logistical footprint and helicopter landing site as well if we wanted to. But that's privately owned, and there would be a large price tag attached to converting that into a hospital. And I think this comes back to Sean's point that Manchester Central could work, and the associated price tag to that is significantly less. Is it the gold standard option? No, but it was absolutely workable and functional. And actually, I would suggest it's probably the nicest looking of the Nightingale hospitals that we could have ever had. So you'll never get away from the politics of it. But the fact of it is, if we need to, we will make it work. We can engineer solutions. I mean, we'll have it in discussion later, but some of the engineering challenges that were overcome were quite significant. With the right people, the right attitude, you can make it happen.
Yeah, I think team is absolutely key. Having the right team in place at the right time, just to deliver that was absolutely the right thing to do, wasn't it?
I was going to add to that as well. I think a key decision actually that MFT made, which was the source of quite a lot of to and fro that we touched on in the beginning of the presentation, was the decision that basically weren't trying to create an ICU. So that's kind of what the Excel London moved towards. And then their decision sort of, I think, sort of went against the grain for NHS England actually at the time. We said, hang on, we want our poorest people to be in hospital. That's where we've got critical care already. You know, this is an emergency facility. So the idea came about that Manchester Central facility was to be used for people to be discharged into when they were effectively on the path to recovery. And that actually made a really big difference and made it easier, I think, to use that facility for that than it would have otherwise been.
It took a while. I think of all of the big decisions, I think that was the one that took the longest to actually crystallize.
Yeah. And
it did change one minute there, because it was all about the oxygen and the methodology that was going to be used to bring the oxygen into the beds. I seem to remember that there was, you know, we were getting to a real critical moment where unless we had that decision, we were kind of having to stop.
Yeah, yeah.
So on that one though, the NHS team that were fighting their cause, so they've made the decision that this is a sort of step down facility. If someone's been in hospital, they've suffered with COVID, they're on the road to recovery, but we want the most critically ill people to be in hospital, which is absolutely the best place for them to be. The Nightingale in Manchester was designed so that they could come out, have the correct level of care, and then move on to their place of home or the next place where they're going to be looked after. That went against the grain of the national direction, and actually the NHS Trust stood by their guns, and they had a heck of a fight on their hands to get that decision approved, and this is what Sean was referring to there. But throughout that whole time, I had a mindful eye on what if that does get turned off. If we get told direction change, as I've explained, happens on operations, how do we make sure that what we've built isn't redundant? So the design was such, you know, it was purposely as such, so that if we had to switch to the national standard, we could absolutely install all the required equipment. It was just a decision as to whether it does or does not happen. It would have worked irrespective either way. It's about building resilience and redundancy into the plan.
I think it's easier with this one actually.
Thank you very much for that. First of all, obviously, an absolutely incredible undertaking from everyone. So I think we can all sort of take our hats off to the speed in which it was all implemented and the result that came out the back of it. I guess from a military perspective, it was obviously invaluable having the military mindset at the start, and I guess sort of dealing with very difficult environment to work in with regards to decision making, and that's obviously it's sort of come to fruition at the end, and it was, as I mentioned, sort of invaluable. Is there anything from the way that this has been designed now that you would be able to take back to the military, or is it very much now in line with what your I guess process was?
So the infrastructure of this nature is very different to the kind of operational equipment-based solutions that we would ordinarily undertake. Yes, we had experience in Sierra Leone with the Ebola crisis and working to a very different clinical model, different logistics chains, but we don't routinely build hospitals. This is an example. The thing that I have taken from this, though, is the idea of modularity and being able to rapidly adapt design. So I'm lucky enough at the minute that the Army's doing another course. Bit of inspiration from what happened here. I've been looking at generative design, and so if we had a generative design model that automatically knew that the minimum bed size space is X and the maximum is Y, and it needs this many widget A, this many widget B, and so on and so on. And then you define the floor area, and it would apply those rules and give you a starter for 10 as a layout. That's got huge value. And if we had a model like that, perhaps even at a national level, when I was doing my initial reconnaissance, I could have literally plugged in the floor plan, click a button, 750 bed spaces, click a button, 300, click a button, and it would give us much better tools, which could then also be plugged into building information model. We'd know how much it would cost, the availability of materials, etc., etc. And then in 10 years' time, if there is another similar kind of outbreak, but the clinical model is different, we could potentially tweak the rules. And because we've already got the footprints of those buildings, we would know immediately what materials we're going to need. It would give you such an advantage if we were to be able to do that. So I'm taking that and running that against a research project for the MOD, looking at operational infrastructure and trying to apply generative design rules based on the experience and what I learned from the teams here.
I think to add to that, just the interesting thing you said at the beginning is this for you is not an ordinary field hospital. So it was neither here nor there. It's not an ordinary hospital to those of us that have knowledge in designing normal hospitals, but it also wasn't a normal field hospital. And actually, I think one of your colleagues said at the beginning of the process, look, this is nothing, guys. I normally, go into we went into an old tile factory with a bulldozer, knocked everything out the back and just started putting beds in. What are you guys faffing about with, basically? You've got drainage, you've got water, you've got electricity, get on with it, And it's that interesting sort of hybrid of the ways that we normally both work, somewhere in the middle of those two things.
Interesting, in New York, in the Javits Center, another conference center, they actually did build a proper field hospital. So it was all the gear that you would normally take out onto, into an active theatre. They basically did it inside a venue. So I don't know the detail of the infrastructure they used, but you looked at it and it looked like the kind of thing you would see in a tent in a war zone somewhere. It was compared to ours, which looked like a state-of-the-art hospital, frankly. And I did joke, I think, to you, Matt, at the beginning. I said, I know you've got your Sierra Leone experience, but be grateful you're not trying to do this in Trafford Park.
Hi. First thing is enormously inspiring at being a tiny part of the construction industry. It's incredible to hear your stories and experiences, but thinking about the pandemic and how it's affected countries across the world in different time scales and different points in time, was the team ever involved in other countries, giving advice or being asked for advice or guidance or you know, was there any connections with, you know, the US or South America or any other countries that you could bring
I think the only
experiences to?
Sorry, I think the only thing I could add as offshore would be Jersey, the state of Jersey and Toronto, Calpine. We were in contact with them on a daily basis. So we'd have a call with them at about 5 o'clock in the evening, and we'd run through what our day had been the day before. They had a much bigger challenge in that they had to actually build a hospital. So they had to put in the drainage, the slab, and build structure, albeit a temporary structure. I don't know if anybody else has been further afield.
I think part of the reason that BDP sort of London put together that graphic and issued that out sort of to be free information for everybody was to try and help those sorts of processes really. And you know, we've got BDP Quadrangle in Canada, and we sort of were sharing information back with them, but more, I guess, on an internal BDP company basis rather than actually like speaking to countries as such.
I think the field hospital that Sean was describing over in the States, that would have been done by the US Army Corps of Engineers. And the Royal Engineers do have embedded liaison officers with them. So there is some passage of information. But I would sort of just caveat that with that each nation's effort is their sort of business. There's a sharing of best practice, and it happens more at the higher level. I think the biggest exchange is probably more likely from the clinical side rather than necessarily the engineering side, because that's the skill set that was most involved in analysing and understanding the problem. The construction industry is responding to that requirement, which is being set by the clinicians. That would be my interpretation.
Question from me. First of all, well done and thank you very much for what you guys did. It's clear through what you did that the supply chain will be pivotal in getting equipment there, getting materials there. How, any kind of lessons learned or knowledge that you took from that, or how did you structure it? What was really important in that process?
Do you mind if I take the first one on this? So I don't think we could have really achieved this without, there's an organisation called the Engineering Logistics Staff Corps. This is an organisation that was created historically from back in the day when all the rail industries were separate, owned by separate companies. You couldn't just get on one train and go from one end of the country to the other. So during the war, when we needed to move stocks, troops, everything else around, the Engineering Logistics Staff Corps, people from industry that do logistics were essentially drafted in, given rank and a purpose, and they would fix a lot of those logistical issues. They still exist today, and we had folks from specifically Network Rail. They were heavily involved. We had the logistics corps involved as well, and because we didn't have the capacity on site to store materials. Network Rail were offering up their yards to actually generate the buffers that we need so we could create our own just-in-time delivery mechanism by adopting that. So we absolutely reached out to industry through the relevant contacts to get the support that was absolutely needed. And they stood up to the plate massively.
I think from a practical perspective, availability of materials was the key driver, because we had a finite time to get those materials in. And I think the initial discussions, going back to the big lever idea that Matt introduced, was what have you got available? When can you get it here? Can you get it here now? And that really drove the whole process. And it was floor, and it was hard, fast materials. It was every bit of material that went onto that site was, we want it today. Have you got it? No. Next, have you got it? No. And it was just literally going through that process on an hourly basis, really, just to identify suppliers and manufacturers that could supply the materials that we needed. I mean, we have a trusted supply chain which we pulled in to actually put the stuff together. But you know, you can't knit without wool, can you? So once the material's there, you've got a chance. Those materials weren't available, we'd still be looking at it now. So
it also drove the design backwards as well. So I remember being told, well, we've only got this amount of doors with vision panels, so choose where you want those vision panels to go, because that's what we've got, and these ones aren't going to have them. So you revisit, you're thinking, you think about that in a strategic way. You go back with the clinicians, say, right, I'm really sorry, there aren't these ones. We think they should go here. What do you think? You've got to get that re-agreed. And then you guys, meanwhile, have pressed the button, you've ordered it, because there's no time to not order it.
It was still kind of before mentality, wasn't it? And
Yeah.
call it once as long as it's black.
Yeah.
You know, that was what was driving the whole process. For
I was about to say, not much room to choose which colour go where, or colour schemes or stuff like that.
yeah, no interior design. necessary.
Emma, oh,
Sorry, could I just add to that, particularly on the supply chain question? And we're all very gracious to take your thanks, but there are a massive amount of people who can't be here today. And one of the ones that I do want to thank in particular are NG Bailey.
Yeah.
They're our M&D contractors, and they were working with us hand in hand along with the design. So we're looking at what ventilation have we got, what can we do? Do we need some extra air handling units? How can we do it? They've got a massive supply chain behind them. And what was really key was that because we're all under this procure framework, the government framework, we have benchmark rates. So we know how much a 28 mil oxygen line should cost, whether there's 300 meters or 6 kilometers. So we were able to go to those supply chain, knowing that they were the right people to deal with it, and knowing, as John said, have a look at your supply chain further down the line. What is available? What can you bring to the party? What can we work with? And we didn't have to go out for multiple quotations and this one says that and this one says that, because as well as kind of monitoring the program on a daily basis, the QS guys are monitoring the cost on a daily basis. So as to have that level of supply chain already in place to be able to give us what we know is value for money and we know is compliant was absolutely essential. So hats off to NG Bailey and all their supply chain too.
Seconded, yeah.
Emma, we got a question, a virtual question. We talked extensively about the decision making and the challenges that brought up. No time, you need to be no faffing about, just make a decision. What other processes or experience as an architect would you be able to carry on using in your normal day job?
So I think really what's key for me is that the amount of different media we were using, so the mock-ups, and we do mock-ups, don't we? We'll do like sample rooms and things like that, but that was like absolutely key. The sort of speed of doing those mock-ups and by whatever means to just get something across, because what you sort of forget sometimes, I think, when you're in the profession that we're in, is that not everybody can actually read a set of plans particularly well. So it's really important to be able to communicate things to people in a way that they understand, and that's where sort of Matt's touched on, you know, BIM and things like that, but that's where, you know, why we chose to model it in Revit, which might have seemed a bit odd when it's such a fast-paced project, but actually being able to grab those 3Ds, sections, plans, etc., from the same model and show them to people as a means of communication. But rather than being something we learned, I guess that's something we were already doing. So it was that alongside the site queries, pen and pencil at the same time, sketching over laptops, whatever. So just, I guess, not being afraid to draw, just draw, just use communication however you can to get the message across. That's the basics, yeah.
Throw one in there. I'll let you expand on it if you wish. But one of the tools that we use is called the rock drill, a rehearsal of concepts, and it's normally for a job, a task, a mission that has multiple moving parts. People often confuse it with a rock drill as in a rock, because we often use them, place them on the floor, that I'm going to be here at this time, and you're going to arrive there at that time, and we will converge, etc., etc. We created a huge rock drill room where we printed out as large as we could the plan of the whole site and just actively encouraged people to say, right, okay, let's go through the process. A patient arrives in an ambulance here. They get into the reception room. What happens at that point? What do we need at that point? And sort of run through it all from a patient's perspective. Then do the same again from an NHS nurse's perspective. Where do they come in? Where do they get changed? How does that, now we're crossing paths. And we could eliminate all sorts of issues that way. And it's just a very simple tool to just rehearse, role play it, run through each of the different options from all of the different perspectives that you possibly can.
But part of that is actually about having the right people available to have those discussions, and it's something that everybody here has touched on already, but having access to all the correct people, because if you're trying to make those decisions but two key people are missing, you can't make the right decision. Another thing we did, actually, I remember one of Neil's colleagues from Arcus helping us with this. We held an impromptu pharmacy user group meeting sort of near the bottom of some stairs, and paced out with masking tape on the floor. How big is it? And he said, well, let me just show him. We just put it out on the floor. So yeah.
It's visualization, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anything else? Are we ready for a party? Won't you go?
where you were to so quickly design and, like you say, mock up as large as possible, you know, the routes that the users would be taking. Do you think something like virtual reality would have been quite useful in those sort of environments where you can, wherever your clients or wherever your consultant teams are based in the country, send them a headset and you can all physically walk through the space virtually.
Potentially, actually, I think it's an odd one because that's something we previously used at BDP, but it's almost like there wasn't enough time to do that, if that makes sense. So the previous projects I worked on for BDP, that's a method we use to sort of explain space to people, and has been really sort of common way of doing it. Part of the issue with that actually was a kind of infection control one of it's this thing that you all touch and you all have to pass around, which is obviously not very COVID friendly. So we're kind of almost taking a step back and, like John said, back to basics, taking something where we normally would use VR and actually using a real life mock-up instead, I guess. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say one of the key interactions that we had between the clinicians as well. There's a lady who can't be here today, Caroline Mullen. She's our clinical project manager. So she spent an awful lot of time in the NHS side and also through construction and chemical planning. So she was able to speak to the users in an operational policy kind of way and not understand that and know how that then translated to us as builders. So
not quite the same things. I think you're referring to visualizing a proposed design in order to aid decision making and to aid the design process. But at the very last safe moment, the night before the hospital opened, we went around with literally a 360 camera to all of the different points and locations, and then stitched it together and created basically a Google Street View of the Nightingale Hospital, and then gave that to the NHS teams. So if they are recruiting new staff and trying to give them a site orientation, you can do it on your laptop, on your tablet. You could put it in VR and do it through those means as well. But that was more for getting people acquainted with the actual site. And also actually, once the main floor plate has gone red and has COVID patients on there, you're not going to get to go on there again, but you could still go and see what's inside there through that virtual tour that we created.
You actually talk about something which is not represented in this panel, but the organizational, the administrative function that actually ran the Nightingale as a hospital, as a business, you know, HR, finance, you know, all of those functions. That was all being built at the same time as the physical structure was being built as well. Brand new team of people that were assembled that came together just for this project. So there was an incredible effort, drawing actually on a number of departments within the local authority as well, to build a functioning business, a functioning trust, which, yes, it was a division of Manchester Foundation, but it was its own entity as well, its own chief exec, its own lead clinical staff, its own administration staff, chief operating officer, all of the things you'd expect to have in a trust established within the space of 2 weeks. It was extraordinary. And, you know, just things like bringing in staff, the induction of people coming in from other hospitals to actually work on the clinical side of it, how they would get their induction, how those people would get hired, how those people would find out what their shifts are, how it all worked. That side of it is also, I think, a really interesting aspect of probably NHS management, really. And yeah, the team involved in that would, I'm sure, provide a very insightful and enlightening talk on another evening about how they did that.
I think it's a shame actually that we don't have NHS representation from the team tonight, because you know they have another side of the story to tell as well, which again goes far beyond any of our experience. It all plays into that same story.
So done. Well, thank you very much. That was incredible and very interesting. With the evening and start our party, yeah? Yeah, are we ready to start our party? Thank you very much.